rated GE. Content carried in here is suitable for general family viewing.
Hello and welcome once again to another exciting episode of Law Matters. We are on episode 3 in the new season, and this is a season where we bring you matters of the electoral process. Remember, this is our legal aid clinic on television, a show where we give you relevant information, education, and sometimes instructions on what you need to do if you're faced with legal issues. Remember, you can catch us on our social media platforms. We are at KUTV Kenya on Facebook, KUTV Kenya Live on YouTube, and KUTV_Kenya on Twitter. It is said by one W. Clement Stones, who puts it this way: have the courage to say no, have the courage to face the truth, do the right thing because it is right. These are the magic keys to living your life with integrity. As you might have guessed, today we are talking about matters of integrity regarding the electoral process. Tonight, I'm joined by someone who knows something about that, and he's going to introduce himself to us so that he can say it best. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Kimel, currently serving as the Executive Director of Africa's Voices Foundation. We see ourselves as specializing in placing the voices of citizens at the center of decision making. But I have spent the last 15 years in the anti-corruption field, holding different capacities in the fight against corruption in this country and on the continent.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you would know best. I think when we were having our side chat, you told me something about Transparency International. Is that what it's called?
Yes, indeed. I served for 10 years as the Executive Director of Transparency International Kenya, and also served 3 years as a member of the International Board.
Okay.
And currently I serve as a member of the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. Okay.
All right, now, let's dig into this topic of integrity. What is integrity in all the context within which you've served in a fight against corruption?
I think integrity can be simplified as doing the right thing, even when no one is watching.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that sums all the tenets of integrity. But if you look at it from a linguistic point of view, it comes from the word integer, which means whole.
Yes.
So when you say someone lacks integrity, you mean that they have something missing. They are not whole.
Okay, something missing.
Yes.
I think to contextualize it for us now, as I've said it at the head of the show, we are talking the electoral process. It is the season for that. But even before that, we know our country has issues with this integrity item. If you look around, people who have been given the task of leading us into using our resources properly for the construction of dams in some parts of this country, issues to do with the recent crisis we had, COVID-19, where the resources that are supposed to go to the citizens to mitigate the crisis brought about by COVID-19, where it is misappropriated, yet the organization has leaders who are vetted. Our politicians, left and right, we hear issues of things to be frowned upon. So integrity. The word is there, and I know you'll tell us that something is in place in the Constitution that is supposed to safeguard that. How do we manage this catastrophe, as some people would like to put it, because really it is?
Yes, I think contextually, corruption exists in Kenya, and it is a problem. I like to see it as the biggest challenge that we face as a nation. almost everything that goes wrong in this country can be traced to corruption. Whether it is and lack of integrity, whether it is loss of public resources, whether it is even the debt question that we are talking about now, or it's our own security and our own development, or lack of. I think corruption is at the center of it. And I think there are government officials and reports that have tried to assess how much we lose as a country. And it's about a third of our GDP every year is lost to corruption. And if you think about it, out of a budget of about 3 trillion, then you can see how much we lose and what that money can do. So we have a challenge of integrity generally, but particularly in our public service. And the cases of corruption that we see are simply symptoms. I think the disease, what we suffer from, is lack of ethics,
right,
and lack of integrity. While our constitution and the laws of this country are quite clear on what is required of our state officers, I think those provisions are observed in breach than observance, and therefore we see all these corruption cases. That's the obvious way in which corruption manifests itself. But it also manifests itself in lack of security. It manifests itself in collapsed infrastructure. One of the ways I try to demonstrate the effects of corruption is if you look on our highways and you see where the trucks drive, you see troughs that are very uncomfortable for you to drive on if you have a small car. That's a symptom of corruption. It basically means either the road was done poorly or the trucks are overloaded. Either way, it shouldn't be happening. And the only reason it happens is because someone has looked the other way. And in many cases, they have been induced to look the other way.
So essentially, if you were to sum it up for anyone who is a lay person who's thinking, well, this integrity thing you keep talking about, why should the officers be vetted and found to be of pure white integrity value, 100% probably? What would you tell them? I mean, I know you've illustrated using the roads, but in a nutshell, overall.
Yes, indeed. I think we have aspirations in this country of having a country that, or a system, a government public system that serves all of us. And we would like to be a developed country like many others. For us to get there, we need people who are going to uphold our aspirations as a people towards higher levels of integrity. And for us to do that, you need to put in place, and the law has put in place processes of making sure that people who occupy public office have gone through a vetting process to make sure that they comply with the requirements of the Constitution, particularly Chapter 6 of our Constitution, which has very elaborate provisions around the integrity, the standard of integrity that is required of public officials, not the least that they should always act in the public interest and not personal interest, which gives rise to the concept of conflict of interest, which again goes to the root of our problems as a country.
Yes, one of the ways through which we get these leaders or people in public service, particularly when politics of representation is concerned, is through the electoral process. So can you expound on some of the ways that integrity is tied in that whole process, the people we elect and how we should get to choose the right ones of good integrity?
Indeed, I think the foundation of the integrity standard is in our Constitution, right from Article 10 of our Constitution, which lays down the principles of leader, the principles of nationhood, as I may call them. And therein, one of them is integrity, accountability, transparency, and such words that are very closely related. And in the electoral process, the IEBC, that's the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, is the body that determines who gets into the ballot. But when it comes to Chapter 6, the body that is competent to determine whether someone is fit under Chapter 6 is the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission.
Yes.
And there are many others that have a role to play, like the KRA and such. That's why when someone expresses interest to be a leader in this country through the electoral process, the expectation is that then the IEBC and related institutions will play their part in making sure that we get the people of integrity to the ballot. And that's the first step. I think the second step really relies on the citizens. And again, I think our constitution starts with ordaining citizens as the sovereign. So that the people of Kenya are sovereign, and that means that they make decisions into how they will be governed. And in this case, one would then expect that they would act in their own interest by making sure that only people of integrity are elected into office.
Because how practical is it for IEBC to be able to vet people vying? In some cases, you have how many candidates for governorship in one county? How many number of MCAs? How practical is that, even for the anti-corruption, commission?
I think fundamentally it's very practical, because it starts with all these institutions that have anything to do with law enforcement, looking into their databases. And those databases are digitized happily, and it's easy to run, to run through and see whether my name is there and whether I've been accused of any wrongdoing or any criminal offense, failure to pay taxes, corruption, and such. And if I have been mentioned, then it becomes a red flag that then the IEBC must be notified and to make a determination whether you should be on the ballot or not.
Before we talk about the being mentioned, because there is a question of malice, then we'll touch on that. You mentioned something about the citizens being really the ones to vet someone.
Indeed.
So what are we saying at that? Because I highlight at the head of the show that there are just so many integrity issues that are, in every sector of society. Does it say something about us as a culture, or what?
Well, I think there's a cultural issue. I see the citizen is really the ultimate guarantor of integrity, because I like viewing it this way, that, if the citizen truly wants people of integrity, then they will have people of integrity. And if they discover someone is not of integrity, they will basically get rid of them.
Yes.
Just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we had a change of government in Sri Lanka, informed purely by these things.
Yes.
And citizens taking up their own positions and saying, no, we can't have more of this. So just to illustrate the sovereignty of the citizen, that even when the institutions are failed, the citizen still has recourse into how they can do that. So in that manner, then the citizen is the ultimate guarantor of integrity. And to the extent that we have all these problems, I think the citizens is not blameless. But having said that, I also know that the institutions, public institutions, have failed the citizen in very many ways. You have cases, for example, where you are presented with a non-choice, one thief against another thief, and you are supposed to choose a person of integrity. In such situations, I don't know how you blame the citizen. So our institutions fail, and therefore citizens are unable to exercise their responsibility effectively. But that's not to absolve them. Ultimately, the citizens deserve the people they elect.
Do you foresee a future whereby we can forego the elections, I should say? I would say 2 thieves and a third one showing up, and then saying, there will be, elections. It's difficult to envisage a future without elections, because so far
with all its imperfections, I think democracy, and I think someone has said this before, that is the worst form of governance.
Yes.
Compared to all the others.
The alternatives.
Yeah. So in that case, then it's difficult to see how the citizens would express their will to be governed, and therefore get into a social contract with the governors in any other way except through an election.
And then now we come to the requirement that it's been highlighted that the IEBC is supposed to see or to vet and see that anyone accused of corruption probably should not be nominated. How, if that was strictly held to the book, how do we safeguard against cases of malice, where an opponent files a case or piles a case or allegations that are too serious not to ignore?
Yes, I think the first place to start in responding to that question would be to go back to the Constitution, and I believe it's under Article 73.
Yes.
Where the standard of integrity is set up, and it talks about appointment based on competence, integrity, and then it adds a provision at the end, or election, in a free and fair election. And I think that has become the problem that we face in this country, because just those 3 words or so mean that you have double standards. And while the Constitution is quite clear in its requirement of integrity for all state officers, I think when it comes to election or elected officials, we have allowed them, and the institutions have allowed them to latch on to that provision, to say that the only integrity check for them is the ballot. Secondly is that we have also different integrity standards, where if you are seeking to be appointed into office, you will be vetted, and your whole record will be put into question. And if you have any unresolved questions of integrity, you are likely to be rejected.
Yes.
And we have history in this country. I think perhaps the clearest one Kenyans might recall was when Dr. Chumo was being vetted for appointment as the chair of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission.
Yes.
And many Kenyans would remember that Parliament said he wasn't qualified because there were allegations about misappropriation of resources while he was at the Kenya Power and Lighting Company.
Yes.
And for that reason, he wasn't appointed. We have a few other contradictions, but I think Parliament was very clear on that issue. On the other hand, you know that there are members of Parliament who have been convicted of or have been found guilty of corruption offenses.
Yes.
And continue to sit. As we speak, they are still members of Parliament, and yet the courts have pronounced them on their guilt. And just because they have appealed, it becomes that they have a clean slate to continue presiding over public affairs. And remember, these are people who will determine the budget, people who will determine who occupies offices at different levels.
Yes.
So you can already say the contradiction, and it's not a problem. It's not hard to see how corruption and lack of integrity are self-perpetuating in this country.
Because really, if there is a decision by a court that you've been found corrupt, filing an appeal, doesn't that mean that you're trying to undo what is already decided on? And therefore, indeed, you should be judged against the current decision in print.
Indeed. I think that's where the problem is, because in our case, and the way the IEBC and other agencies like to interpret the law,
yes,
they say, and actually there's a provision that provides that, that you need to have exhausted the levels of appeal,
yes,
for you to be barred from seeking office. But I think the fundamental question that we must answer is is about the standard. What is the standard of integrity that is required?
Yes.
I think you will hear politicians and even the IBC itself has thrown the issue of fair trial protection
yes.
into this debate. And I have always wondered whether we have internalized the purpose of the fair trial concept, which is drawn from criminal law.
Okay,
and
because that's heavy.
Yes,
I think when we come back from break, you can expound on that. And so, because there are several issues sitting right now during this season that some people are wondering, scratching their heads, how are they allowing this to go on? Stay tuned. We will be right back. Still your host, Dr. Ngugi Kingara. We'll be back.
Today we are at Yale Bridges to bring you cybersecurity and immersive technology.
From the interaction with the customer, at the end of the day, we want to assure them of their security, of their infrastructure, of their systems. So when we come in on board, we don't just sell a product, we deliver a service. With virtual reality, we've actually managed now to use the new technology to be able to simulate environments that probably people would have been to be there physically, but now we put these spaces in virtual space and enable our participants to join in.
Je, ni jawabu gani ambalo kwamba aliwapatia? Mtume ambia awala adullukum ala shay'in idha fa'altumuhu tahabbtum. Hela siwajulishi jambo ambalo kwamba mkilifanya nyinyi, mkilikamata nyinyi, mtapendana. Mtume akaambia afshu salama bainakum, enezeni amani kati yenu. Angalia, yani maswahaba walidhania wataambiwa mambo makubwa, walidhania wataambiwa jambo ambalo kwamba ni labda la faradhi.
Cancer is the second leading cause of death in the world. However, chances of survival have increased due to the improvements on screening and treatment. In fact, Cancer Awareness Day is celebrated every year on the 4th of February, seeking to create global awareness.
Cancer, if diagnosed early, is curable. It's important that when you discover an abnormal swelling or a change in skin color or your normal body contour, that you seek medical attention early so that if it's cancerous, it's detected early and actually treated.
This week on Focus on Health, we are going to be demystifying matters cancer.
Welcome back. Remember, you can catch our conversation on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook and YouTube and on Twitter. Look at the graphics, you'll be able to see the call for that. Now, you are about to tell me the integrity test that should be used.
Yes, indeed. I think I was just beginning to explain that the IEBC and many politicians will argue that being denied an opportunity to vie for office on account of cases that are in court
yes.
is an abuse of fair trial safeguards. And the question that I think has not quite been determined and is important is to understand whether indeed the criminal standard, which is the one used in criminal law, is the one applicable to integrity issues. And I think I would posit that it is not.
Yes.
Criminal law has the primary objective of apportioning guilt or innocence for purposes of punishment.
Yes.
And I do not think that when you are seeking to get leaders, that is the right standard to use. And remember that the burden of proof in criminal cases is beyond reasonable doubt. So if as a judicial officer you are presented before me as an accused person,
yes.
and I have any doubt as to whether you committed the offense you are accused of committing,
yes.
I am required to acquit you. So you get the benefit of doubt. if you flip that, it basically tells you that the standard we are using now is the lowest standard anywhere. I think even the devil himself will find himself on the ballot if he came here, yes, because that's the standard that we have used.
So for you, you would propose we use which one on it?
I think the integrity standard that I read in our Constitution and in our Leadership and Integrity Act is an ethical standard. And it is not for purposes of punishment. I think it is informed by the fact that leadership is a trust. And you cannot trust anyone who is tainted unless you have an assurance that they are not what they have been accused of. And I think for us, I think for me, the argument should be that anyone who has unresolved questions of integrity should not be allowed to vie for office. And unresolved questions of integrity means they are either accusations or you are in court and has not been cleared. Because this country has no shortage of people who can lead this country, people of integrity. I do not think we should be going to our remand centers and to accused people for them to lead us. I think we need to give due consideration to this standard. And the standard of integrity for me that is applicable is that only those who have no questions of integrity hovering over their heads should be allowed to be on the ballot or should even be appointed into public office for that matter.
I seem to agree with that, and I think this is where the question of the responsibility of the citizen to do their own work in terms of how they should be led should kick in. If the threshold is just so, like you put it, even the devil himself would get away with it, then they should be the one vetting these candidates. But it seems to be different. And maybe because of this important element of finance.
Yes, in a sense, yes. I think citizens have a role to play. But as I have said before, I think citizens are not given a blank card to choose leaders. They are presented with candidates by the IEBC. And I think primarily the IEBC and the other institutions that are involved must make sure that we don't get criminals into our electoral system. Because if the citizens do not have a blank check to decide who they want to lead them, they are presented with choices, then those choices must be determined through a process that is above reproach. And yet we know that our political parties nominate candidates that have unresolved questions of integrity, and that we know that the IEBC has failed time without number in safeguarding that requirement, using the explanation that I have just given you, that until someone has exhausted their appeal, all levels of appeal, then they cannot deny them. I would like to challenge the IEBC. They should actually clear. They should not clear such people and let them go to court, and we see what happens. Because what we require right now is for the for the courts to pronounce themselves on this matter. The politicians are interested. They are conflicted. They act in their interest in contravention of our Constitution, which requires them to act in the public interest. And as long as they do that, and they are the only ones who have the competence to enact our laws and determine these processes, then we will be coming back to this place we are in at every election.
Every election.
Yeah.
Now, I know you've been in activism, having cited Transparency International. We know its history, it's a stage in this country. I'm just in my creative mind thinking, what would happen if we refuse to listen to IEBC and say, until you give us the people we think you should give us because we haven't vetted them as citizens? What do you think would happen?
I think the IEBC would argue that you have a choice to make of the candidates that you have been given. And
but you, IEBC, I brought you the people, and then they were vetted and we could see loopholes, and you are the ones who approves. Then, citizen, where do I go?
I think the IEBC would argue that you have a right to exercise your vote wisely and vote for those who you think are best suited to lead you, including independent candidates who offer themselves for election. And I say this because there is a preoccupation in this country with candidates that are perceived to be front runners, and other candidates who may not have the name and the political gravitas are neglected, yet they might actually offer the solution to this country. And unfortunately, the front runners always come with baggage. Yes.
It's a history of corruption, as you put it.
Indeed.
And it's a bad history because many politicians that we know are front runners right now. There are cases pending, and one of those aspects related to that is the question of campaign financing.
Indeed, I think campaign financing is important. It's actually at the core of democracy. And the idea of campaign financing is to make sure that electoral outcomes are not influenced by money. So theoretically speaking, I should be able to seek the vote and get voted into office based on the policies that the agenda that I espouse for the people, and not the amount of money I have. But unfortunately, the evidence is there that the cost of running elections or campaigns increases every election. And in this country, I think now we are talking about billions of shillings if you are seeking the presidency, and tens of millions if you are seeking to be a member of parliament. And the idea is that the campaign finance laws are supposed to make sure that, one, illicit money does not drive the election outcome.
What is illicit money?
And illicit money here is money that is stolen, or money that is state funds. Basically, public funds should not be used to fund campaigns.
Right.
Money from criminal groups should not be used to fund campaigns. And as a matter of fact, if you stretch it further, money from foreign interests should actually not be driving our election agenda, because that's the primary expression of our sovereignty, and you want to insulate it from all influence. But unfortunately, I think this country has had a failed experiment with campaign finance regulation. One of the requirements or the functions of the IEBC under the Constitution is to regulate campaign finance. And the IEBC has failed consistently. One, because there was no law, because there was no appetite among members of parliament to enact this law. And finally, the law was enacted. And when it was enacted, it was the date on which it was supposed to come into force was moved, I think twice or thrice. And eventually, when the IEBC gazetted the rules, Parliament rejected them. And I think there's a decision that has come up now from the courts to say that the IEBC can actually gazette those rules without them having to go through Parliament, which means that they are still in force.
So now, how can a date be moved? Was it done arbitrarily? Okay, it's tomorrow. No. Tuesday. No. Is there a procedure that...
Self-interest, I would say. Self-interest, because this is Parliament acting. And Parliament is made up of politicians who are the active participants in an election, and who so far have actually not been interested in their campaigns being scrutinized or regulated. So anything that is supposed to put checks and balances on where they get their money and how they spend it is frowned upon by politicians. And therefore, I think if we were to get a functional campaign financing law, campaign regulation law, then we will need a lot of push from the citizens, because Parliament in itself is again conflicted to be able to give us a law that is functional and that has bite. At the moment we have the law. I think the IEBC, I doubt, will be able to do anything about campaign financing this time around, which means another election will have passed without this important aspect being acted upon. The risk is that if you allow illegal money to come into this country,
Yes.
it could influence the outcome of the election. It could lead to state capture, and you could end up with a narco state, for example.
Yes.
Like we have some states in Latin America that have criminal gangs based on narcotics trade that determine the outcomes of elections and many other processes because of the amount of money that they wield. And money has the capacity to determine outcomes of elections. And we know that even in this country.
True. Now, it just sounds so, I'm so weak, I can't do anything. Because the institution that is supposed, tasked with that is unable to. But then how do we safeguard against that kind of foreign interest money? And also the money that we have given to people in public service to serve us with, and they misuse it and direct it to their own campaigns, knowing what you just said about, for example, the IEBC's weakness.
Yes, indeed. I think we have to work every day to a more perfect democracy. And I don't think there is a silver bullet to it. I think in terms of fighting corruption, in terms of upholding integrity and ethics, there are usually three ways that I see as self-reinforcing. They are mutually reinforcing. The first one is that you have to prevent. So you have to make sure that you do everything to make it impossible for people to engage in unethical behavior.
Yes.
Secondly is to punish, which means that those who engage in criminal activities or unethical behavior are sanctioned, because it is through sanctioning that you are going to reinforce the prevention side of things. I think the third way is to make sure that those who benefit from illegal activities
Yes.
do not actually benefit from them. So if I am found to have misappropriated funds, those funds are supposed to be taken back, recovered from me,
Yes.
so that I don't benefit from it. Because the motivation for an ethical conduct, the motivation for corruption, is the benefit that I derive from those activities. If the benefit is taken away, then the incentive for me to engage in it will have gone.
But then the voter now comes back into the picture in aiding and abetting. There are those people who will argue money stolen so long as it's circulating within our community, whether through the unga they bought for me, the t-shirt which they bought for me saying my name,
Indeed.
and I needed a shirt. What did you tell them? Because they're seeing tangible things that are in their mind, enhancing their lives in ways that without it probably would be poorer.
Yeah, I think the Kenyan voter just needs to reflect the last few decades of this country.
Yes.
And look at, one, the amount of resources that we lose as a country. Secondly, look at the caliber of leaders that we are continuing to get in every election, and realize that that's a very short-sighted way of looking at things. Yes, you can get that packet of unga, you can get that t-shirt or that kip, but what is the cost?
Yes.
At what cost? It's at the cost of you not being able to access quality health services. So today you have very many sick people who cannot access healthcare
Yes.
because of mismanagement and theft of public resources. And those are as a result of getting people into office who lack integrity or do not even know what they're supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And so today I know that particularly among the young urban population,
Yes.
the more outlaw you look and act, the more likely they will be attracted to you. The risk, of course, is that these young people have the biggest stake in the future. You and I have lived a significant part of our lives.
Yes.
They have the whole of their future is ahead of them. So they have the largest stake. And it is really upon them to know that how you use your vote. It might look like it doesn't matter, but it actually does matter significantly.
Yes. Now, I want to bring into the picture the other stakeholder that is significant in our country in terms of how we live our lives and decisions that are made based on the input by that stakeholder. And that is the church, or the spiritual organization of this country, and its input in maybe educating or even influencing decisions the voter makes. Yet, in relation to finances, there's a history of it receiving those finances, and yet speaking from the other side of the mouth saying, no, you have to be a person of integrity. Well, what do you have to say about that? Because this is real.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think the religious sector has an important role to play, perhaps a unique role in helping this country build our ethical fiber, which is pretty much torn. And I think the religious sector is the guarantor of morality and moral values in our country. So it has that very important role. But remember this, the churches and the religious organization in this country exist within a corrupted setup. So I think it's a question of, if you might look at the scriptures, that you are in this world but not of this world.
Yes.
But as long as you remain in this world, you will have to go through all the things that other people go through, and for that reason, I think we cannot be overly harsh against the church, but we must be firm in demanding that the religious organizations play their part. One, in weeding out an ethical conduct within its ranks, and secondly, in providing and rallying, the society, including government actors, into a higher level of integrity in our country. And I think in that regard, recently, perhaps the first time ever, I think religious organizations and some churches actually came out to say, we will not allow politicians to donate to us money. We will not give them podiums in our places of worship to perpetuate their agenda. And I think even though there is no unanimity in the way they are acting, I think it's a good beginning. Because I think when you go to church, you are equal before God, and therefore there's no one who should be treated better or differently than the other. And secondly, I think in terms of giving, the local congregations must learn that the building of churches is their responsibility.
Yes.
And I do not think that God revels in huge buildings. He will look at the heart and the sincerity in worship. So you might be in that Mabati structure. God will still hear you and hear your prayers. If you can afford genuinely, without having to rely on illicit sources of money, the big churches, well and good. But I think it is not proper for congregations to feel being pushed to build assets that are well beyond their means.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I think because the religious sects have the largest constituents, most people are voters in those congregations, therefore I think they've heard. Very well, let's leave it there. We'll come back in the third segment to answer questions and receive comments that you may have. Stay tuned.
Yeah, because it's always sweet when they are fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So you're advising event planners to make these as the last.
Yeah, you're going to go to weddings and you're going to be served a fruit dessert and no, I can't take this. The reason is it was made 2-3 hours before. Yeah, so the fruits have already become stale. Yes.
Driving and riding without incidences on the road is such an amazing experience. But do you know while many road traffic crashes are avoidable, human behavior continues to be the leading cause. Speeding, lane indiscipline, drunk driving, distracted driving, failure to wear a helmet, and failure to use available pedestrian ways have been flagged by NTSA as the fatal 6 behaviors likely to lead to a fatal crash and serious injuries. As part of the Usalama Barabarani campaign, we request all road users to prevent these fatal 6 behaviors for their own safety and that of others. When driving, ensure your speed is within the stipulated limits, the road ahead is clear before overtaking. Stick to your lane, keep left unless carefully overtaking. You're well rested if driving on long distances, and you never drink and drive. Usalama Barabarani starts with you. Fika Salama. This message is brought to you by the National Transport and Safety Authority and the European Union.
Speaking of change, what is your policy as an independent candidate?
Well, I believe that we deserve more than we get. We need to vote so that we can pick between the wrong leaders and the right leaders. And most of the time, politicians don't make a change in the country, but leaders do.
What is pushing you to vie for this particular seat?
To make this impact in the youth, that we will have a change in the infrastructure of the town, we will have a change in how things are administered, from bursaries to everything.
Welcome back to our third and final segment. This is the segment where we get to answer your questions. And as it is our tradition, we will start with our studio audience. Can I get the first question, please?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, and my name is Kimani Njenga, and my question to our guest is barring people who are found to have integrity issues from contesting in elections a solution to curbing corruption in Kenya? And if not, what would you say is the most practical and most reasonable solution towards curbing corruption within public governance in this country?
Okay.
Yes.
It's very clear.
Right. I think it's barring people who have unresolved questions of integrity hovering over them from vying in the elections is an important, perhaps the most important step in ensuring that only people of integrity get into public office. Remember, the people we elect make our laws, they make our policies, they determine how money is going to be spent. So if you allow crooks to get into that space, then you can only imagine what the outcome would be. It would be tantamount to getting a thief to be your watchman or your house help. So you know what the outcome will be.
Very, very well put, because it still boggles my mind. Some of the key people, the murder cases, allegations, serious corruption issues. What are we saying about the voter who is presented with the people? These are the people we are bringing to you. I think we should start there, really. And I'm glad to see, I think this is the first time we've seen in all places where, in the counties, you have very many young people. Of course, I don't know, because some of them, they're calling themselves funny names, and I'm thinking, are you really serious? But because you are young, I think this is where it should start. And because you know something about Transparency International and what we were talking about earlier, the days of activism that changed this country to a good level, maybe that's what we need. And the young people have the energy to do that, in saying, no, that one, no, we can't choose that one. Rather go independent.
Indeed, I think the youth of this country have a very special opportunity to change this country. You and I, even if we voted to the last man or woman, we cannot change anything in the outcome of an election.
That's true.
I think the people in this country who are 35 years and below are now close to 80% of our population.
Well, Kimani Njenga, start your activism on answer to your question. Okay, a second question, please.
My name is Kelvin Kimani, and we know that one of the most fundamental ways in which the people can keep on check of their members of parliament on their own integrity is through the right to recall. So my question is, what is the legal framework and practicability of the current laws on the right to recall?
Right to recall a candidate. Yeah? Good question.
Indeed, that's a very good question, Kevin. Again, I think the fate of our recall laws is the same fate as our campaign finance laws. Again, you are dealing with people who are making laws from a conflicted point of view. And I do think that this again becomes the fundamental question. So when Parliament was enacting the recall laws in this country, they made it very difficult to actually recall someone. And I do not think it's going to be practically possible under the legal framework that we have today to recall anyone from office, because the law has, while it purports to be a recall law, has made it very difficult for you to recall an elected official.
Can we use the one whose precedent now has been set? You've been found incompetent, and therefore you vote of no confidence. It has happened in some counties for some governors.
Yes, what has happened in counties in Kiambu and in Nairobi are impeachment processes, which I think can work, and it is a good thing that it has happened, because then it sets a precedent. But remember, there are also other governors who probably ought to have been impeached who have not been impeached yet. But the question is, once someone has been impeached, can they actually legitimately and legally seek to hold office after that?
They go to Mombasa, that's what they do. Third question.
For the purpose of records, I'm Wangi Jabez. What advice would you give to the public when aspirants with allegations of corruption are brought before them in the ballot in the day of election?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, a very good and pertinent question.
Yes.
I think the question that I would pose to the electorate is this. If you are seeking to employ a watchman or a house help who is going to be taking care of your house and look after your kids, if that person faces allegations of child molestation, allegations of theft, would you care whether those allegations have been proved or not for you to employ them? If you would, then you have your answer. Reject anyone who has unresolved questions of integrity hovering over their heads. That's my advice.
I couldn't put it any better. For real. Okay, another question? Maybe the last one?
Good evening. My name is Murakaru Daniel, and my question is on the challenge of ethnicity towards ensuring the promotion of integrity. So my question would be, what would be the advice of our guest today concerning the defenses that politicians give that they have been maliciously prosecuted and they appeal to their ethnic supporters? So what would you advise people who hold on to ethnicity when it comes to the fight towards curbing integrity in Kenya?
Okay, the Kenyan way. My people are being attacked.
Yes, a very good question. I think as he was asking that question, I was asking myself, what really is the content of our ethnic identity? What makes me a Kikuyu, a Kamba, a Luo, a Luya? And I think the more I look at the young generation, the people who carry the vote to make a difference today, I actually see very little that defines them ethnically. So the only reason why anyone would use ethnicity is because it's to divide people, to divide people from one another, so that you people who have nothing really to show that you are Kikuyus or Kambas except your name can begin to see your differences, so that they can exploit those differences to to attain public office. And I think it's actually a bankruptcy of ideas. It's what drives people to do that kind of thing. It's what drives people to drive also religious factions. You know, you drive a wedge between religious groups so that you can benefit from the fallout. I think it's the same thing, and we must see that for what it is and reject it.
Reject it, indeed, reject it, but also as you're doing it, be one of those who are taking the proactive role in shaping the integrity degree so that it goes higher. And the people you're voting in are people you want to leave your kids with, as you put it, and don't employ the watchman who will take all the keys and open all the rooms and take away all the loot, and then you're left poorer. With that, we'll call it an evening. And we want to thank our studio audience for the good questions and the always. And we also want to thank our crew who makes this show happen every evening. And most importantly, our guest for gracing us with your visit to our set, and also for your knowledge and insight. And also to thank you for the history of activism, because this is why we speak so freely here. We also want to thank the Green Grant funders for the support, and Kenyatta University School of Law for being part and parcel of this legal aid clinic on television. We also want to invite those others who want to participate in sponsoring us so that we do more work to come on board and do it with us. Goodbye.